Just a little bit about me. My name's Kate Evans and I'll be chairing today's discussion. I'm an Associate Solicitor for Capital Law and I specialise in energy and construction projects. I'm joined today by representatives from industry, business, the legal sector and academia to discuss the challenges and opportunities that they have experienced in real life in seeking to achieve or helping clients achieve their net zero ambition. Now I've got all of that out the way, let's jump to it. So COP26 will be taking place in Glasgow from the 31st of October to the 12th of November this year. The UK government literature prepared for the upcoming event states that to keep the temperature of the planet under control, limiting its increase to 1.5 degrees, the science dictates that by the second half of the century, we should be producing less carbon than we take out of the atmosphere. This is what reaching net zero means in this context. According to UK government, around 70% of the world's economy is now committed to reaching net zero emissions. Accounting for half the global economy, all countries that make up the G7 have updated their 2030 requirements to put them on a pathway to net zero by 2050. Whilst it remains to be seen what agreements will be reached by the world leaders involved in COP26, one thing is certain. The way we view both public and private sectors and the way they operate in the UK is already changing to accommodate these new climate commitments. There is no doubt that this is a complicated area and it can feel overwhelming for businesses at the start of their decarbonisation journey. The talk today is designed to touch on some of these areas which are commonly dealt with by companies in their decarbonisation journeys. And at this point, with me today are 4 speakers from industry, business, law and academia who will be touching on some of these strands from their own perspectives and how they've approached them. So you might see here already, but at this point, I just would like to introduce our panel, which is on screen. And you'll see here we've got Catherine James from ROCKWOOL, and she's Public Affairs and Sustainability Advisor. We've got Andrew Marsh-Patrick from ERM, and he's a Consultant Director in the Corporate Sustainability and Climate Change. Danielle Bragg, a colleague of mine from Capital Law, and she's a solicitor on the same team, Construction, Energy and Projects. And last but not least, we've got John Madden from USW, and he's the Director of the Hydrogen Centre. Jumping into the panel then. My first question would be for you, Kathy. And I'd just like to wondered if you'd be able to talk to us a bit about science-based targets and ROCKWOOL's approach to these.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kate. So I'll start with what science-based targets are. So back in 2015 at COP21 in Paris, a legally binding international treaty to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels was agreed, and this is known as the Paris Agreement. So that's a great high-level ambition, but to actually be effective, it needs to be broken down into what it really means for different actors on the ground. And that's where science-based targets come in. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, it's a partnership between CDP, so the Carbon Disclosure Programme, the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute and WWF. Now, they set out best practice in emissions reductions in line with the latest climate science. They provide expert advice to companies when they're developing their own decarbonisation strategies, and then they assess and verify those targets so that they're meaningful and they're aligned to the SBTI net zero trajectory. So why did we go for SBTI over sort of many other initiatives out there? We're a global company, so we operate across Europe, North America and Asia. So we need something with international applicability. And we've got some history with this. Our sustainability strategy, which we launched in 2015, is aligned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So our products, you may know our insulation products, which is are based in the UK, is what we make here. But we also produce ceiling tiles, cladding panels, horticultural substrates and engineered fibres. Those products collectively positively contribute towards 10 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But we've also set 6 targets to reduce our operational impact. So we already had a goal around decarbonisation, which was to decrease our carbon intensity. So that's the amount of carbon dioxide that's produced for every tonne of stone wool that we make. But we wanted to go a bit further and to really be ambitious. And we were looking for a way of tagging that onto something, with international applicability, but also that sort of showed a meaningful action. So about in terms of the SBTI, then who sort of sets targets with them? There's about 2,000 companies worldwide so far have made a commitment to setting science-based targets, and just under 1,000 of those actually have approved SBTIs. So the majority are low energy intensity, so financial companies, real estate firms, that sort of thing, and energy intensive companies are really in a minority, even though we've got an awful lot to offer in terms of that journey towards net zero. So in terms of what we asked ourselves in approaching this process, we sort of wanted assurance that the SBTI governance and the approach was credible, and we're satisfied that that was the case. We wanted some understanding of how the carbon budgets and the emissions reduction scenarios were calculated, so to get a real feel for the kind of science behind what they were doing. We needed to understand how climate neutrality is defined for a company. So we have a production process, and obviously we very well understand the energy use and the emissions associated with that process. But as a corporate entity, obviously it goes much further than that. And we needed to understand exactly what it was we needed to measure, and what kind of actions we could take. We also needed to look at how this would work over time. So decarbonisation for an energy intensive company is not linear. So you don't get this sort of smooth year-on-year reduction in carbon emissions. You have sort of big technological developments. It'll be something like fuel switching. Now, as an example, we've got a plant in Norway where we switched out one of our furnaces for an electric melter. Now, introducing electrification of our process makes sense in countries where the electricity is largely low carbon, which is the case for Norway. It's all renewable energy, and that led to an 80% reduction in carbon emissions from that process. So we're going to get these sort of big step changes over time rather than this nice linear process. So just because we're not following that smooth trajectory, it doesn't mean that we're off course. We needed to just understand how that would work for us and how we sort of report against that. We wanted to see some examples of companies like us who had already signed up to the process. So there is an obvious advantage in being the first mover and being a sort of innovator in that space. But I think it's always sort of wise to ask the question of why haven't other people committed to this? Is there something that we're not seeing? We just wanted to make sure that we were comfortable with being one of these sort of few energy intensive companies to have made the commitment. And in terms of sort of future risk, there's also the fact that climate science is always evolving. Our understanding is evolving. Could the goalposts change? And we're already seeing that happen. So the Paris Agreement was this sort of well below 2 degrees. That's the basis on which the Science Based Targets Initiative set up their processes. And now there's this push towards 1.5 degrees instead of 2 degrees. So that needs to be accounted for over time as we move along towards our goals. So I'll just cover what our goals are briefly. I won't go sort of deep into the sort of definitions because I think some of this will be covered a bit later in the discussion. But our scope 1 and 2, which is essentially the fuels that are used in our production process and the electricity that we use, we've committed to a 38% reduction by 2034, with 2019 as the base year. And scope 3, which is essentially everything else that makes up being a business, so our raw materials, our transport, business travel, those sorts of things. We've committed to a 20% reduction in the same time frame. So overall, that will lead to a 1/3 reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions by 2034. Now, in terms of the challenges, I think being an energy intensive company does give you something of a good base to work with, because the majority of our carbon emissions are associated with our production process and they're very much within our control. Whereas if you're pushing harder on your scope 3 emissions, you're sort of relying on your supply chain coming with you. So there is a lot that we can do there. However, the technologies that we need to take us to that sort of net zero future are still very much under development. And there is a reliance on external infrastructure as well. So if hydrogen were to be introduced as an example to supplement our natural gas usage, then where do we get it from? Who's supplying it? How does it get to our site? Similarly, for electricity, are we able to source sufficient electricity from low carbon sources? I mean, we currently only procure renewable energy on our site in Bridgend, but if we increase that that amount of electricity is that available and at an affordable cost, and also there's the infrastructure of actually getting the electricity to site. It's not just a case of plugging in a furnace to our existing supply. CCUS, I think, will also have an important part to play over time. And again, that sort of infrastructure needs to be developed. So how do we take the carbon out of the process? How do we collect it? Who collects it from us, or where do we take it to, and how is it dealt with from that point on? So we don't have all the answers yet, but we are working very hard to look at our options and to put in place the plans that are going to take us towards those goals. I think points to note on science-based targets is they are absolute targets, they're not relative. So it's our greenhouse gases, again, not just carbon dioxide as a whole, and all organic growth that we have as a company in that time, and we are a growing company, also comes within scope. So the amount of carbon reduction we need to make over time will increase as we grow. And yeah, so that's our story with science-based targets. So I'll hand back to you, Kate.
Great, thanks, Kathy. That's really informative, and I think, as you mentioned, it kind of links in well with our next speaker, Andy from ERM. Andy, thinking here of the things Catherine has mentioned, I believe this links quite nicely with some of the stuff you've been undertaking related to carbon accounting and Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. Would you be able to share some of ERM's experiences with these processes? For example, through ERM's carbon accounting work completed so far, what level of ambition are you seeing for decarbonisation? It sounds to say ROCKWOOL is making great strides in this path, but have you got any further experiences that you can add to this?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Yeah, and so just to introduce myself, I work for ERM, leading our net zero team. I'm joined by my colleagues Holly, Dean and Lizzie, who've been supporting SWIC on the carbon accounting in South Wales. A lot of our advice is around setting science-based targets for industrial clients. And part of that journey that Kathy mentioned was really to understand the baseline emissions and the possible technologies that may be available to reduce those emissions over the next 5 or 10 years. So yeah, a big challenge is really assessing the Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So if we think about the major industrial sector operations in South Wales, we've got paper, iron and steel, cement, some other fairly energy intensive operations around LNG. So all of those sites will have usually a fairly robust Scope 1 and 2 inventory for the direct fuel use and for their electricity use. And one of the big challenges we find is that there's a lot of gaps in information in the wider Scope 3 supply chain emissions piece. And so we maybe talk about that in a bit more detail, because to sign up to SBTI, which Kathy mentioned, you need to have mapped out Scope 1, 2 and 3. And if Scope 3 is more than 40% of your footprint, then you need to have a target for that as well. So we've been working with 12 industrial partners in South Wales, and we're at the stage of having gathered most of the data from them, and we can see some clear patterns emerging. And please do type any questions you've got into the chat box or raise your hand. But essentially, we found that most of the industrial sites have some firm reporting requirements, often due to EU ETS or UK ETS as it's now called, to report the direct emissions from site. So there's a lot of consistency in how they report the direct emissions from fuel use and combustion on site, and any fugitive emissions of methane or F-gases. But when it comes to Scope 2 electricity reporting, there's quite a variation because you can either report on the grid average factor, or you can report on your specific contract with your electricity supply, which might be green tariff or some renewables. So there's quite a difference there in Scope 2 reporting. And then Scope 3, most of the partners are really just starting on that journey. As Kathy mentioned, it's a huge task to map out all of the carbon in your supply chain, everything that you might buy in terms of raw materials and feedstocks, any transport, and then also the end use of your products. So scope 3 is a much bigger exercise, and many organisations are just starting on this journey. But what we do know is that the end customers, such as Network Rail for steel and Highways England for cement, for example, they're requiring their suppliers to provide data on the embodied carbon in those products that you sell onto them. So there's a lot of supply chain pressure from all angles to start to quantify that wider carbon footprint. There's also a number of reporting requirements as well that you might be trying to respond to. So there's, we mentioned the emissions trading scheme. There's also the SECR, Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting Requirement. There's CDP, Carbon Disclosure Projects, and then also there's the new TCFD on financial disclosure related to climate change. So all of these different reporting systems have different boundaries, different requirements, but essentially you need to have a really good database of all of your energy and carbon across scope 1, 2, and increasingly scope 3 to be able to address those requirements. So we're finding that the companies have some good vertical accounting within the organisation, but there's more variation when you look across the sector, slightly different approaches in terms of reporting. And in rough terms, I think emissions from Wales in 2020 around 37 million tonnes of CO2. That's 30% lower than the 1990 level, and roughly a quarter of those emissions are attributable to industry operations if we don't count the scope 3. So this is just direct emissions. So I think that there's a big challenge there. That there's the Climate Change Committee report on the Welsh path to net zero by 2050. Some great progress already, but a huge challenge then to switch away from the higher carbon fuels potentially, look at things like hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, renewables, electric vehicles. So all of this sort of baselining work really then feeds into how do you set a target for emissions reduction, and then you need to have a roadmap behind that to understand how you'll achieve those emissions reductions in partnership with the other industry sector operators in South Wales and the government initiatives as well. So I think it's a huge challenge for industry, and South Wales is a critical part of the UK energy and raw materials infrastructure. And there's just a lot more pressure now on operators and pressure from investors and customers to do more on measuring and reducing those emissions. Some of the emissions might be very hard to reduce, and that's where we start to look at things like offsets or renewables as compensation measures. So I think, yeah, that's the challenge that I know that Kathy and ROCKWOOL and others, the steel and paper companies and cement companies are all struggling with. And it's certainly in the lead up to COP26, we've seen a lot more questions from investors. So we work with some of the banks and investors, and they're asking questions of their assets and their portfolio companies around how they're addressing this scope 1, 2, and 3 emission issue. So yeah, I think there's a couple of questions here in the chat. I don't know if we want to take those now, but I think that the first one is just around the average grid factor. So yeah, there's a government review ongoing to make sure that we remove double counting of renewables, so that if you buy a green tariff or a renewable certificate, that it's counted once and once only, and it's not sold to two customers by the generator. So there's a big issue there around avoiding double counting for renewables. And then in terms of the second question was just around the carbon footprint of a product. It is the responsibility of your customers, but also in the way you manufacture and design that product, then there's a certain embodied carbon in it, and potentially a carbon emission when it's used as well. So we're looking at interesting things like low carbon concrete for construction, low carbon steels, as in lower embodied carbon steel, and also recycling and reuse of raw materials to reduce construction related scope 3 emissions or embodied carbon. So I think that the whole pressure is coming from along the supply chain, and it's not just the scope 1 and 2, it's the scope 3 as well now. And that really links on to then around how do we address the wider supply chain issues. So I think that Danielle is going to pick up now on the next question.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, it links in really nicely. I see that we've had one or two more questions, so if we pick them up at the end, potentially with ERM there in relation to yours, but thanks very much there. Yeah, Danny, I'd like to pick up an interesting point here that you raised with your Scope 3 emissions, which Andy and Kathy have both touched on already, and the fact that these are less established, which could present issues in companies seeking to decarbonise the supply chains. And as Andy pointed out there, you're seeing end users putting more and more pressure on suppliers to show that they're reducing their embodied carbon. Danny, you work with both public and private sector organisations, and we understand that these are under a lot of pressure to make public commitments covering all aspects of environmental, social and corporate governance. Are you aware of any changes which would affect the speed of which companies are expected to start greening their supply chains?
Hi, Kate. Thanks very much. Hi all, my name is Danielle. As Kate mentioned earlier, I'm a solicitor on the Construction, Energy and Projects team at Capital Law. So just to go back to Kate's point there, so yes, we have recently seen a change in the way in which the Welsh and UK governments have moved to embed decarbonisation ambitions within their procurement processes. So in June this year, the UK government released a procurement policy note, or PPN, entitled Taking Account of Carbon Reduction Plans in the Procurement of Major Government Contracts, which is a little bit of a mouthful, so I'll stick to PPN for now. So the PPN applies to all central government departments, their executive agencies and non-departmental public bodies, and it'll be relevant to public procurements worth £5 million and above. The Welsh Government has also adopted this PPN. So the WPPN will apply in the same way to Welsh Government contracts from the 1st of April 2022. So essentially, if you're a relevant public body in Wales procuring a contract or service which is £5 million plus, then you'll have to demonstrate that you've considered taking steps to combat climate change within your processes. So just as a general point on this, although it requires a different system again to be used in the strategy for the tender than if the bidder was using science-based targets or the UN Race to Net Zero, which have both previously been mentioned by the other speakers. So there is a slight risk that this might add some further confusion because it's just another document that companies may need to pull together rather than relying on potential current strategies they may have in place.
Great, thanks, Danny. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself in time there then. So what, in your opinion, do you think companies should be thinking about in terms of the decarbonisation strategies? Just pulling up there, you said that there's multiple different ways to, reach that net zero carbon route, and then they don't seem to necessarily all be lined up. If you could just add a bit more there, that could be interesting for our listeners.
Yeah, sure. So while the PPN and the WPPN apply to public procurement, all businesses, including the private sector, will benefit from having some kind of green credentials. So there are opportunities to be realised from being ambitious and publicising your organisation's achievements in decarbonising your organisations. Perhaps that could be on your website or in other publications, and definitely when bidding for contract opportunities, which might ask for you to sort of publicise what you've done so far. So as Andy mentioned earlier, there's definitely been a shift in what consumers want from the companies they purchase goods and supplies from. So we've seen a real rejection of greenwashing and virtue signalling in the last year or so. In so much that the Financial Conduct Authority has actually launched a consultation a little while back and recently published the summary of its findings from an analysis of the effects of presenting investment funds as sustainable on consumer investment decisions and the mis-selling risks that could be associated with doing this. So needless to say, it's really important to get this right when preparing your own climate adaptation and carbon reduction strategies. And companies can certainly start doing some things already to assist with this, such as having good governance procedures in place within your own organisation, but also trying to understand your supply chains better as well.
So supply chains, those are an interesting point. How can organisations ensure their supply chains are considering and committing to climate reduction or carbon abatement?
Yes, it's a good question. As Kath mentioned at the beginning of the talk, particularly if you're relying on scope 3, then you're reliant on your supply chain coming along with you. So ensuring the same level of compliance across the supply chain comes down to a number of different factors. So I can give you a brief overview of some of them. Communicate your requirements with your supply chain at the start of the process. It would be a really important but basic concept. So don't let it be a surprise or something that you spring on your supply chain after the contract's been awarded. So allow your potential contractors to plan how they might try to reduce their carbon emissions from the outset. Otherwise, you might see contractors or bidders in a process trying to recoup some of their costs further down the line. If there are specific tender or bid documents, make clear in the specification what these requirements are in terms of levels of compliance. So you can then go on to set out how an organisation has to demonstrate it will be able to comply with these carbon reduction requirements. If it's a public sector procurement, then the organisation's bidding will generally be familiar with this process and being transparent in terms of how responses will be evaluated. But a competitive process should encourage bidders to be on their A game, depending on the competition for the particular contract. So this can only serve to encourage best practice and push for positive steps towards carbon reduction in the supply chain as a whole. Have commercial clauses that place obligations on the contractor to comply with these requirements and clearly set out what will happen if they don't. So depending on the contract which is being procured, failure to comply with reducing carbon emissions is unlikely to result in a termination. However, it could be used to trigger performance management meetings between the contracting entities. Consider the option of rewarding suppliers as well. So we don't always want to be punishing our supply chains. We should be seeking to reward positive behaviour and actions. So the thing to bear in mind here is obviously rewards do tend to be financial. So this type of provision has to be factored into the potential costs associated with managing your supply chain if you chose to go down that route. Contract management is key, and that can often be where things fall down. So good contract management means investment, so making sure the contract managers are trained to understand the contract. The contract's supposed to be a working document, so it's not really going to do anybody any good if it's drafted, signed, and then stuck in a drawer and gathering dust. And the only time it's taken out is when you're looking to award a replacement contract, or it's being referred to when the parties are having a bit of a bust up. It also means that someone should be employed to manage one or more contracts. Depending on the size of the contract, it may be that one person is just looking at one, or perhaps it could be a number that they're working on. Contract management may make up some or all of that person's role, but please note again, there will be a cost there that your business needs to consider.
Great, thanks, Danny. Final question then for you, just from obviously as a law firm, you are advising clients day in, day out on these kind of issues. What sort of challenges do you notice clients are normally facing in relation to this spectrum that you haven't picked up on already?
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I should preface this by saying that my background is more so as a construction lawyer, but our team does deal with procurement queries as well. But we work regularly with clients on these types of factors. So particularly in public procurement, where there are mechanisms for capturing social value and measuring the output, then there's a clear link to facilitating the measurement of decarbonisation targets as well. So having the same level of contractual ambition as your supply chain having the same level of ambition is more than just a contractual clause. So you need to get buy-in from your supply chain and their organisations into what you're actually trying to achieve. But it's essentially telling them a story. So getting them enthused about what you're trying to achieve, but also how it can help their businesses in turn as well. So unless an organisation works exclusively for one particular client, the drivers for ambition are going to come from multiple places, from within their own client base and any stakeholders, and from wanting to do the right thing and protecting our future generations as well. So I think that probably leads into what John's going to talk to you about on education and skills training as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, just picking up on, as you say, skills and education is something that we're going to be talking about next with John. And it kind of links quite nicely actually into the point which Kathy made earlier regarding that issues such as fuel switching, etc. For example, well, if we're going to increase our electricity capacity, then have we got enough of that clean electricity in the first place to be able to do that, and how these new tech is being developed, etc., to assist with our decarbonisation journey. But what we can't forget here is also we need to be taking people along on this journey and ensuring we've got a trained and skilled workforce to be able to deal with new emerging tech and operate within that system as well. So John, I'd like to ask you to jump in here. I'd be interested to learn more about the potential disconnect we're facing between, as you say, these emerging tech and the availability of the skill sets to be able to install and operate them. Would you be able to talk us through this from the academic point of view? For example, what work universities and FE colleges are undertaking to try and bridge this gap?
I'll do my best. Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I think it was clear when we developed the concept and started to build the South Wales Industrial Cluster into something that's got to where we are now of a large number of partners. That it is a partnership arrangement between industry on the one hand and academic partners and also with government. And one of the key elements was that we can see that not only is there a lot of technological change that's needed, but as we've seen from the discussions earlier, that there's impacts on legal and administrative, economics and finance. There are a whole series of skills gaps that perhaps go beyond what you might think is just sort of STEM-based skills or ability gap moving forward. So I think it's holistic. We need to think across the board in that sense. And from that point of view, the aim of our joint activity between not just myself and the group at USW, but the broader academic community in South Wales is to support industry partners in identifying where there are, what the skills gaps are, what new skills will be needed, and trying to ensure that we can address those gaps by modifying the provision that's available to meet those needs. And then there's a bit of a two-way street in that clearly we're also involved in R&D that is looking at new technologies, and as we implement that new technology, that also informs the course provision that we've got. But I'm mindful that that's also, and sort of where perhaps government come in here as well. Back in July, Green Jobs Task Force published their report, and I'd agree with the idea that we need to, from their report, that we need to build pathways towards green careers, and that's very much the case in South Wales. We've got a more industrial economy than perhaps the rest of the UK, and as was clearly stated yesterday, our intention is to decarbonise, but not to lose that industry, but to improve industry and to maintain and develop our economy by positive decarbonisation in that sense. So keeping our industry competitive. So what does that mean? It really means that industry, education, and the government need to work together as much as possible. And it's as broad ranging as you can get. It means that we need to engage with at school level to ensure that STEM subjects are and curricula for STEM subjects are modernised, brought up to date, and recognise the technologies that we're going to develop. At FE level, that means traineeships and apprenticeships. There's great provision from a number of FE colleges in South Wales to support and work closely with industry partners, but we need to again work closely to improve the offering and ensure that our apprenticeships and indeed degree apprenticeships are reflect what our future needs and what industry's future needs will be. And it's certainly clear that we need to try and develop a workforce at that level, as well as involving the HE sector. So clearly, from our side, we need to look at what our degree, what our undergraduate programs are, and what our postgraduate programs are, and to ensure that they again reflect the needs of the industry in South Wales. But as I say, it's not just about STEM subjects; it's also about even in your own field of law, but also economics, finance, etc., and so on and so on. All of these things need to be updated to take account of what's a fast-moving world. And that idea of course development. I mean, for example, we've offered courses on hydrogen for the last 2 decades, for example, at postgraduate level. And colleagues at other universities do so as well. But we need to continue to ensure that those are made use of. And the other element that I would say is there's a large part of upskilling existing workforce, and I think there's a clear need for us to engage to ensure that there are short courses. We've had a revolution over the last 18 months in terms of online course provision, and within the education sector we're all now very used to delivering courses online with an interactive audience, and that to me seems an ideal route for us to be able to deliver continuing professional development type courses with industry partners that will upskill existing workforces as well. And all of this has to embody community engagement. The communities around our industrial partners in South Wales, they're effectively a key source of future workforce in that sense. So engagement with community and embracing the idea of inclusion and diversity within that, I think, is very important. I'd also point to the fact that what we're trying to do builds on some of the R&D work that has gone on within, particularly within South Wales, and I point to the idea that from projects like Flexis project and the RICE project, Sustain, and specific projects, we're now coming together to build something called the South Wales Industrial Transition from Carbon Hub. So the acronym is SWIC. And that's largely a partnership between, so led by Swansea University with Cardiff University and my own university, working together and building on our research specialism. So in my case, hydrogen, but it includes biofutures in that sense, carbon management, net zero buildings, net zero transport, and a range of other key specialisms. But within that, embodying the idea that we will work as closely as possible with industry and government to try and deliver skills and training to ensure that we can meet the net zero challenge in that respect. So the only other thing I'd say is that I've had what I've said so far, it's had a very sort of South Wales focus, but I'd also mention our engagement with the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre, and with that, again, a lot of its programme as it now develops is technical and looking at the sort of technical challenges, but there's a key strand of IDRIC, which is about the development and ensuring that the skills are fit for the future in that sense. And my aim, our aim, as part of the South Wales Industrial Cluster is to ensure that we can work with the other clusters in the UK to establish best practice on skills training and development in that sense. So I perhaps that was a little bit sort of overview, but I think that gives a view of the activity that's taking place, and it's a big challenge, and I think often our focus is on the technology and not necessarily on the people and skills, but ultimately, we need to bring forward a workforce that's going to be able to deliver net zero carbon over the next coming decades.
Great, thanks, John. That concludes our speakers. We've got 15 minutes left for questions at this point. I don't know, Tony, if you're there as facilitator to maybe field some of those questions and how you want to play that. But as I say, there seem to be quite a few coming in there in between Danny and John's talks. So maybe it's best to hand over to you at this point.
Yeah, could I go back to one of the original questions about Scope 3? Because I think some of it's like the inputs and outputs, so it's probably more towards Andrew and Catherine from ROCKWOOL. So if you want to show yourselves on the screen, the Scope 3 side, I think the question also meant was we've got Scope 3 coming into some production facility, and I've got Scope 1 and 2 obviously being added at that point. So does everything then become the Scope 3 for who I'm supplying? If I got that question right, that's maybe an interpretation I took on it. And so it's what is actually passed on. Is everything passed on to the end user? A bit like VAT, I suppose. Taxes always come into it. Catherine, could you go first?
Yeah, so I think I sort of put out an answer to that. I'm not sure how helpful that was. So I look at sort of product footprint as being our the life cycle impact of your product. So we have environmental product declarations which set out impacts across a wide range of environmental issues. So you've got carbon contribution to global warming, but there's also a whole host of other impacts as well. So the boundaries for those are Scope 1, Scope 2, and a little bit of Scope 3. So you will include transport and extraction of the raw materials. As you've put it there, in terms of our embodied carbon as a product in our Scope 1 and 2 and 3, and whether that then goes on to be somebody else's Scope 3 input, my understanding is yes. Okay. In amongst everything else that they do.
Because you've also got like the use of recycled material, haven't you, that comes into yours? So presumably, does that enter your supply chain as a zero as well?
It depends on the material. So it depends because like we've been using steel slags in our process for a long time. It acts as a flux in the process and it gives us the right chemistry that we need. Now, is steel slag a waste product? Is it a byproduct? Is it a co-product? And it all sort of comes down to how the steel producers classify it, and then how it sort of works its way into our production. So we've typically always classed it as a waste product from the steelmaking industry that we then include. So therefore, it forms part of our recycled content. That is changing. So as this point has been argued, I think, by the steel manufacturers at a European level in terms of how environmental product declarations are drawn up, and they've successfully changed the classification of it. So it's now, I think, a byproduct, which means that it comes with some of the steel making impact in it. Although the product itself hasn't changed, they can now allocate some of the carbon that's associated with making the steel to the steel slags as well. So we would start then taking that into our process, and I think we do count some of that already. But for our material, for example, where we've taken it back as a waste product, at that point it's kind of finished its previous life, so it's crossed a boundary from its previous life cycle into a new life cycle when we bring it back into our process, and therefore it comes with a kind of zero clean slate, so to speak. So that, yeah, the more recycled product you can get into your process, the better. I think Johan also raised a point about circularity, and I think that's a very, very important point to remember, is that you shouldn't recycle for the sake of it. You need to think about the sort of ongoing life of the product. So our product can be recycled infinitely without sort of degrading its performance, which is great. But if you include, I don't know, plastics into new bricks or whatever, are you going to be able to get that plastic out again afterwards? Or, is it going to become a problem in the future? So we need to, be thinking about some of those sorts of things, ensuring that circularity is also brought into, we're not just saving carbon at the expense of everything else.
I think, yeah, just to add to Kathy's point there, that so as manufacturers, you can reduce your scope 1 and 2 emissions, and your scope 3 from the raw materials you purchase, and that then when you sell that product becomes the scope 3 purchase goods and services of your customer. So there's lots of double counting in terms of reporting emissions when you think about scope 3. But what we are seeing is the likes of Network Rail are saying to the suppliers of steel, well, can you provide a steel that's got high recycled content, for example, or low embodied carbon because you're using different fuels. That's just one example. Also, then if the steel went into a lighting column, then if that lighting column is an LED light, it's low energy use during its useful life. So that's the use of sold products as well. So and products which recycle with materials or have a longer life will have a lower scope 3 impact. So I guess that what is someone's scope 1 and 2 is the customer's scope 3, and yeah, I think trying to grapple with scope 3 is much more complex than the scope 1 and 2 reporting. So it is a challenge for many of the industry sector operators.
I think one of the challenges, especially for those smaller businesses within South Wales, is actually like getting good advice in that area and actually understanding. So I think certainly some of the larger companies can help in communicating almost their understandings, that possibly could help as well, really. The renewable tariffs seem to put a string of comments together. It's something that we've struggled with as an organisation. Is the answer black or white in terms of, if I buy a renewable tariff, has that been subtracted from the average grid factor? You're smiling, Andrew. Yeah.
Yeah. So DEFRA publish UK grid factors each year, and it's supposed to account for the current generation mix, but then so you can use that as a grid average, and it should include all generation and all consumption in the UK, including any import from France, for example. But essentially, if you have signed up to a power purchase agreement for renewables or a certified green tariff for 100% renewables, then you can report your emissions from electricity use as zero rated. Your supplier should be able to provide a certificate to that effect. So yeah, there is a question then, if you're reporting zero, then should everyone else be reporting a higher factor to compensate? So I think there's a government review ongoing about how to treat emission factors, and even within the government departments, BASE and DFT, they can't agree what factors to use in which situations. So it's very complex, and I think it's under review. But all I say is, if you follow the DEFRA guidance, then you're following the same as the official line at the moment.
Do we know when that review will be concluded?
I'll have to double check. It's only recently started, only recently announced. Okay. So I imagine it'll take a while. And I think the other thing to add then is just that the grid is rapidly reducing in terms of the average carbon factor. So that helps with lower reported emissions if you're using the grid average. But yeah, if you've got a particular tariff you signed up to, or a power purchase agreement, then do get the actual factor from your supplier, and it will be even lower again. So this is, we want to avoid double counting, but we need to follow the official guidelines.
I think it's almost just gaining clarity, Andrew, isn't it, as to what's there, so that we've all got confidence, basically. It informs how companies go about decarbonising. If they want to pay extra on procurement, then they can. If they want to invest, they can. So it just provides surety and comfort in investment. Could I ask John Maddy a question, please? And hi, John. How do we crack the training and skills requirements within the SME sector? Because if we start looking at some of the new challenges, we're going to have startup companies, new technologies, as you were talking about on the R&D side. Yeah. Those sometimes quite often come from that SME sector, and almost it's a difficult one to actually help service. So any thoughts on that, or how large companies can help, really?
Yeah, the thing that always strikes me is that we're not coming from a standing start, and I'll sort of part answer your question, and also the question that was put in the chat about sort of, you know, the courses or schemes to develop installation of new technologies, and that was focused on things like heat pumps and hydrogen boilers, etc. I mean, what I'm heartened to see is, for example, when it comes to EV charging points, the training bodies and certification bodies for the electrical industry, so people like NIC, EIC, do have commercial courses aimed at existing electricians to, you know, upskill them to enable installation of EV chargers. Now, clearly, some of the technologies that you're alluding to are, you know, yet to be as widespread, perhaps, as EV chargers. But, you know, it strikes me that the same thing could be said for, you know, the gas industry trainers. So that I noted that there's a course on heat pump installation that the Gas Assessment and Training Centre offers in Treforest, and those effectively say, okay, well, we've got a core set of skills and the, you know, traditional trade background of gas installation, electrical installation, and those are very often the sort of people that are going to be within SMEs, and therefore, you know, we can work with those, especially the certification bodies, to you know, to apply training courses that are, you know, short, sharp, and guaranteed to get you know, people up to speed. And I think very often we'll think, you know, within the HE sector, you know, we think of larger courses and what, you know, how we tailor that. But I think, you know, this is just emphasising the point that it's across the board, and it builds very much on that existing core skills that we you know, we can do pretty well, and it's not completely new. It's just amending and improving existing skills in that sense.
Thanks for that, John. I think there's a bit of a conversation going on with PAS 2060. I don't know whether Andrew wants to just sort of wrap that up. I think he's liaising with David James on the chat.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Sonny. So I guess there are different ways to set your carbon targets or carbon neutrality or net zero ambition. We'd always said that it's good to follow an official standard and get that verified in some way, so you can use it in terms of your public disclosures. The leading ones at the moment seems to be SBTI. It's not the only one, though. There's also the UN Race to Zero, which many universities and public sector organisations are signing up to, and it's a similar approach. And then there's the PAS 2060 standard, which I understand is the carbon neutrality standard, and also aligned with the ISO standards for carbon verification and measurement. So those are the three main ones we're seeing being taken up, but there are lots of others as well. I think the Carbon Trust has a standard as well, you know, for smaller organisations. So I think it's whichever makes sense for your sector and your company in terms of the structure. So many of the manufacturers are part of bigger international companies, but certainly these aren't mandatory requirements today. You know, the SECR and UK ETS is the mandatory part, but these other schemes sit well alongside that. I think that certainly investors and customers are asking for more information on carbon emissions and reduction plans, and we talked, Danielle talks about the PPN guidance for public contracts. So I think there's just more momentum and pressure now to disclose those emissions and have a reduction plan, and choose whichever standard best fits your organisation's activities and the sector's approach. There are also some sector-specific pathways, BASE and published decarbonisation pathways for chemicals, iron and steel, for example. So I think there's a lot of information out there, but the challenge then is to set targets that really they're backed by the board level, that customers and employees and suppliers buy into them as well and support them, and then have a detailed roadmap to support that delivery. That's the challenging bit, is delivering against the targets. So yeah,
I'm just going to ask. I'm going to pass back to Kate, but Kate, if you could maybe ask Danny how she could, some of the practical advice that she gave on actually starting to bring this into procurement contracts, how we make that maybe a few tips or something. Can we start to put that on the SWIC website or things, just to start that engagement going? But I'll leave you to wrap up now, Kate.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Chip in there. There's a question in the chat from Martin Bromley, which I don't think has been picked up yet. So just quickly chip in on that. So thanks, Martin, for your question, which was, what is a good approach to existing supply contracts? So first and foremost, it's important for businesses to consider the cost implications, both for their own organisation and for their downstream suppliers, especially if they're SMEs. So you need to make sure what you're committing to isn't a financial burden on your organisation or downstream suppliers, if you can help it. And that's particularly in light of investing in technology, data gathering and analytics that's needed to ensure alignment across the organisation and efficient reporting to stakeholders. So setting your own targets is just the first step, really. The second would be to understand and quantify the real emission baseline for your own organisation into measurable units. Then you can put a clear strategy in place for how those emissions can be reduced. And it's from there that you'll be best placed to have discussions with your supply chain. And open and honest discussion with your supply chain is key, really. Thanks for that.
Great, thanks, Danny. We have now reached 3:30, so it's the end of this session today. If we can just share the slide again of everyone's contact details, that would be great. And if anyone's got any kind of follow-up questions or any further points they'd like to make offline, then feel free to send any of our panelists an email. And I'm sure we can circulate this maybe to the distribution list for those who've attended as well today, in case you aren't able to get this noted down in time. But I'd just like to thank all of our panelists today for their interesting discussions. It shows what a great breadth and depth of considerations we have to take into account here when we are actually looking at a journey to net zero and how actually complicated it can be. Hopefully it's demystified some of it a little bit for you. And as Tony's just mentioned there as well in the chat, a recording will be on the SWIC YouTube channel if you want to come back and revisit it at a later date. On this point, thank you panelists, thank you everyone who's attended today, and we hope to speak to you soon. Thank you. Bye.